For some time, the 13th dynasty had full control over Egypt. However, at around 1700 BCE, the royal court moved to Thebes and lost control over the north. At this point, it is unquestionable that the second intermediate period had begun. Unlike the first, where various Egyptian lords shared power, the second intermediate period had a far greater degree of political prominence from foreigners. The kingdom of Kush in Nubia regularly interfered in the affairs of Upper Egypt, while the Delta became ruled by foreigners from Asia. The rulers of the Delta acknowledged their non-Egyptian roots, calling themselves Hekachasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands, a term that later Greek accounts rendered as Hyksos, a name still used today. Later Egyptians depicted them in negative terms, but in reality, the Hyksos were eager to preserve and absorb Egyptian culture. They became the main symbol of the second intermediate period due to how this period was portrayed by ancient sources, as a period of unrest and calamity. The fertile lands of the Delta were those which slipped away from the 13th dynasty's grasp. It would be ruled, instead of Ichtawi or Thebes, from Xoes, in modern-day Sacha. It would be through the capitulation of this 14th dynasty that the Hyksos would establish themselves in Egypt. They would rule over the Delta at large from the city of Avaris, initially a mere town founded by Amenemhat I. Being a popular destination for Asiatic migrants, the city gradually grew, containing many non-Egyptian elements. It would eventually be hit with an epidemic of some sorts, but would recover. A king of the 14th dynasty, Nehesi, would choose it as his new royal capital, and it would remain as such during the rule of the Hyksos. The city would become so wealthy that it would remain as a capital even after the conquest of Memphis. Eventually, the Hyksos would control most, if not the entirety of the country. Beneath the First Cataract, the kingdom of Kush had regained its independence. In the Hyksos capital of Avaris, the cultural and political history of the second intermediate period is reflected. It shows a hybrid culture in which both Egyptian as well as Asiatic elements fuse together. From the 12th dynasty onward, many of its inhabitants are either foreigners or descendant from them, maintaining their own traditions while at the same time absorbing Egyptian ones. They maintained their burial practices, which were not like those of the Egyptians, yet saw fit to write their names in hieroglyphs or adopting Egyptian names. This cultural melting pot is hardly surprising, since Avaris was a port of trade between Asia and Africa. The arrival of the Hyksos also brought several technological innovations to Egypt, which was much needed since the country had been lagging behind its Asiatic neighbors in this particular aspect. The Asiatics used a fast wheel for pottery production and seemed to have practiced more advanced bronze working and weaving techniques. Their weapons were more efficient too. They used composite bows rather than the earlier Egyptian straight bow, had special battle axes, scimitars and daggers, and may even have had full body armor. It remains unsolved, however, whether or not they introduced the horse and the war chariot. It's unquestionable that after the second intermediate period, the Egyptian army started to include a chariotry, as did all other armies in the Near East. But we do not know when exactly this technology entered Egypt and under what purpose. It is possible it was introduced by the Asiatics, but later kings eventually adopting this military innovation is not entirely out of the picture. On a more peaceful level, the Asiatics also introduced new musical instruments. As mentioned before, the Asiatic rulers themselves use the term Hekachasut to describe themselves, as a way to define their distinct identity. They did not hide the fact they were foreigners, nor were ashamed of it. However, this practice eventually ended, and the final kings of the 15th dynasty no longer used the term and presented themselves fully as traditional Egyptian kings. The later Egyptian historian Manetho asserted the Hyksos originally came from Phoenicia, that is, modern-day Lebanon, and the language they spoke is recognized to be West Semitic from the Syrio-Palestinian corridor. Despite the fact they were foreigners, the Asiatic rulers wanted to be known as Egyptian kings as well. They had no issue with being called the sons of Ra, and restored temples to the Egyptian gods and dedicated cult objects to them. The Hyksos were not opposed to Egyptian culture. They actively promoted it. Because of the scarcity of sources, it's hard to piece together the political history of the 15th dynasty. Both Manetho and the Turin King List speak of 6 rulers. Scholars generally assume that during its century-long existence, the 15th dynasty gradually expanded control over northern Egypt from its core domains in the eastern delta, eventually reaching Middle Egypt. Some inscriptional evidence with their royal names appear south of Thebes, but it's likely that was taken there in a later period and does not show control throughout Upper Egypt. The Turin King List names other rulers besides those from Avaris and Thebes, and contemporary inscriptions on seals report even more names. Some of them are West Semitic and others Egyptian. They are grouped into the 14th and 16th dynasties, but they are collections of short-lived kings who ruled over small territories. The 16th dynasty, which ruled from Thebes, is sometimes called the Little Hyksos, as Africanus, translating the works of Manetho, calls them Shepherd Kings, a title also given to the 15th dynasty. It's difficult to determine how far the power of the Hyksos extended into Asia, a region in which they had close contacts, as the archaeological evidence shows. When the Theban ruler Ahmose of the 18th dynasty ended Hyksos rule in Egypt, he sent a military officer, also named Ahmose, to sack the city of Sharuhem in southern Palestine, which was portrayed as the final blow against the Hyksos. It's unlikely that Hyksos' control over Palestine was beyond the very south, as no evidence for such political control exists. Syria and Palestine were home to many city-states, often in conflict with one another. Such military incursions are unlikely to have been tolerated by a central power that dominates over the region. When the 13th dynasty came to an end, another political evolution would take place. Late 13th dynasty kings became unable to supply the lower Nubian forts with new troops. The Egyptian occupation over the region had ended. Oddly enough, however, the troops that were stationed in those forts remained, and they maintained trade contacts with Egypt. The absence of a strong military backing, however, led to the re-emergence of the Kingdom of Kush, which would further pressure the kingdom. Kush itself would greatly expand, eventually controlling the entirety of the Nubian Nile Valley south of Egypt. In the middle of it all, there was Thebes. Home of the vanished 13th and 16th dynasties, it would give rise to another true Egyptian dynasty, the 17th. The kings there behaved as the successors of the 13th, carrying on the Egyptian traditions. How the 17th dynasty came to be established is unclear. It's likely the 17th dynasty only attained true sovereignty in its later stages, and that throughout most of its existence it remained as a vassal of the Hyksos, and a loyal one at that. However, the chronology for this dynasty is extremely uncertain, and the king lists provide very little help, as Manetho provided no names and the Turin king list is badly damaged in this section. It's assumed that this dynasty lasted about a century and coincided with the 15th. There is evidence that the two dynasties went to war against each other, and indeed, this dynasty would lay the groundwork for Egyptian reunification and the end of the Second Intermediate Period. In one account, which reads like a story, the last king of the 17th dynasty, Kamos, sat with his council and complained about the division of the country.
To what end do I know my own strength? One chief is in Avarice, another in Cush, and I sit here with an Asiatic and a Nubian? Each man has his slice in this Egypt, and so the land is partitioned with me. None can pass through it as far as Memphis, although it is Egyptian water. See, he even has Hermopolis. No one can be at ease when they are milked by the taxes of the Asiatics. I shall grapple with him that I might crush his belly, for my desire is to rescue Egypt, which the Asiatics have destroyed.
Though Kamos's advisors pleaded with the king not to start wars, he ignored them and attacked, reaching the Hyksos capital of Avaris and plundering it. The king of the Hyksos, Apepi, tried to get the kingdom of Cush to assist him in the war against Thebes, writing a message with the stated intent of carving up Egypt between the two. But the message never arrived, as it was intercepted by Kamos's men. Kamos's story of this campaign ended with a description of the general joy of Egypt's population. But this is the typical account of the victorious, which is biased and hard to evaluate for its veracity. The only other explicit account of the war is the biography of the soldier Amos, son of Ibana, which credits the defeat of Avaris not to Kamos, but to his successor, also named Amos, the first king of the 18th dynasty. It's possible that Kamos laid the groundwork for the reunification of Egypt, but how much he accomplished is difficult to say. As shown from Kamos's account, the struggle for reunification was presented as a war of liberation, but the truth of the matter is a little more complicated. The War of Reunification had likely been started by an earlier 17th dynasty monarch named Sekenenra, who died a violent death in his 30s. Why he chose to confront the kings of Avaris is not clear, as evidence from the late 17th dynasty shows the relations between the Thebans and the Hyksos had been friendly. We don't know much about the religion which the Hyksos practiced. These people had come from the Near East and maintained several of the customs which were rooted in religious beliefs, such as burial practices, and so it is assumed by most scholars that they would have continued to honor the Syrian deities. But the evidence for such cults is very limited. The rulers, on the other hand, seem to have rapidly adopted the Egyptian gods as their own, demonstrated by the use of the title Son of Ra. This image contrasts remarkably with how the Hyksos were portrayed by later Egyptians, which paint the Hyksos as focused on their aberrant foreign religious beliefs. In fact, Apepi would later be presented as a ruler which honored no god other than Seth, worshipping him as if he was Ra. The conflict between Thebes and Avaris was thus framed in terms of the city's cults. It was a religious clash between the Egyptian and the foreign. On one hand, the sun god, which emerged as a fusion between two deities of north and south, Amun-Ra, and on the other, the god of confusion, disorder, destruction, and the foreigner, Seth. Starting from the New Kingdom, the latter would be increasingly associated with foreign lands and their deities, like the Syrian Baal, the Libyan Ash, or the Hittite Teshub. Indirect evidence does suggest Seth had a temple in Avaris, but this did not mean that the Hyksos worshipped Seth at the expense of all other gods. and the evidence points to the exact opposite. The association of Seth with the foreigner does not mean the Egyptians disrespected the god. Indeed, future pharaohs would be named after him, and when the eventual ruler Ramses II moves the capital back to the Delta, he shows great respect for the god's cult, portraying him as the champion of Ra. When Egypt comes out of the Second Intermediate Period, its position as practically untouchable from foreign threats, as it was during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, was not and would not ever be the same again. At this point, the ancient Near East has abandoned the Middle Bronze Age and has entered into the Late Bronze Age. With it came new political and diplomatic dynamics. From the south, the Kingdom of Kush re-emerges as a threat, one much more serious than in previous times. But the biggest shift was in Asia. New empires have emerged. In Mesopotamia, where once the Akkadian Empire, the Neo-Sumerian Empire ruled from Ur, and the Babylonian Empire forged by Hammurabi stood, a new power emerged, as the Kassites have occupied what was once the domains of Hammurabi. North from there, the Hurrians formed the kingdom of the Mitanni, and would, in due time, occupy Assyria. And finally, perhaps most important for the coming history of Egypt, a new empire had established in Anatolia, one that would be a true rival for the country, the Hittite kingdom. Egypt, and most notably the Delta, is far too close to turbulent Asia to be disinterested from Asiatic political events. And so, by necessity, the autocratic kingdom, once by and large closed in upon itself during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, will become an aggressive one, that of the New Kingdom. In order to fulfill their role as a major player in this new concert of the Middle East, the resources of the Nile Valley alone are insufficient, both in raw and human resources. The New Kingdom will be the height of Egyptian power, and where the kingdom's most famous historical figures are chronologically located. Egypt, once reduced to controlling the Nile Valley and its surrounding deserts, will expand far beyond its previous borders. The New Kingdom was initiated by Ahmose I. He extended Thebes' political control on all of both Upper and Lower Egypt and expelled the Hyksos from the country. The designation is somewhat pedestrian, disguising the true novelty of the era. Egypt was politically whole once again, but as mentioned before, its interactions with neighboring regions were crucially different from before. The militarism and ideals of foreign conquest that had arisen during the Middle Kingdom led to an aggressive imperialism which was directed against all its neighbors. A king like Thutmose I, the third pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, could boast that Egypt ruled supreme over the entire world.
I made the boundaries of Egypt to the extent of what the sun encircles. I made strong those who were in fear, for I repelled evil from them. I made Egypt superior to every land.
However, unlike in the past, when Egypt only fought against those who were much weaker than them, the New Kingdom would deploy its armies against equal and even superior opponents. As much as the pharaohs would boast about their power, they were not in a position to solely dictate the terms of their international relations. The pharaohs often had to negotiate with the other rulers of the surrounding great states and try to avoid an all-out war against them. During the Old and Middle Kingdoms, Egypt was largely isolated from the rest of the world at large. Their military campaigns were primarily headed southward and into areas of Asia they were nearby, most notably the Sinai Peninsula. Of course, Asia itself did have strong centralized states during this period, but whatever contacts Egypt had with these powers, they were sparse at best. The situation changed fundamentally during the 16th century BCE. As the new kingdom emerged, so too did new powerful states around the eastern Mediterranean. These states all engaged with one another, be it in political, military, economic, and cultural terms. Their correspondence with each other was constant and intense. Besides Egypt, the main powers were Kassite Babylon in southern Mesopotamia, Assyria in northern Mesopotamia, the Mitanni in North Syria, and the Anatolian Hittite state called Hatti. At the periphery of this world stood Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, and the Iranian kingdom of Elam. Oddly enough, the territory lying at the center of this world, that of western Syria and Palestine, remained politically fragmented, without a strong local centralized rule. It would be the battleground for these powerful states. Each of these states would go through their particular ups and downs, but the international network that formed would persist for about 500 years. Egypt would be an active participant in this new world. Its rulers campaigned in the region in an attempt to expand both territory and political influence, and so would come into direct contact with other powerful and expansionist rulers with ambitions of their own. However, the relations were not always hostile. All kings realized the value of diplomacy. They formed an informal club of great powers, whose members exchanged diplomatic messages, gifts, and brides. They engaged in wars, but also concluded peace treaties and alliances. Egypt was a part of this system, but not a dominant one. No single state was, and so it could not dictate the rules of engagement on its own. There was no doubt the new kingdom was an imperialist state. The country annexed territories far outside its traditional borders and for its own benefit. This policy had its roots in an earlier period, with the Middle Kingdom in particular coming to mind, but peaked during the new as Egypt was in an almost permanent state of war. Born from a war against the Hyksos, the new kingdom armies would be on campaign at a regular basis for the next 150 years. This is reflected in a shift on how the pharaoh is portrayed. The god on earth is now too a warrior king, distinct in his courage. Not only were the enemies of the pharaoh portrayed as cowards who fled from the Egyptian army, even the pharaoh's own soldiers paled in comparison to their leader when it came to bravery on the battlefield. Battle accounts often presented the Egyptian army as a hindrance to the king's prowess. Advisors would recommend caution, but the king would take the dangerous path and succeed. His troops would begin looting the enemy camp before the battle was won, and the king had to be the one man to save the day. The king would single-handedly massacre countless of his foes. Evidently, this portrayal is rather dubious in its veracity. Of course, in reality, the army was crucial to the king's success, and in the new kingdom, it underwent important changes. During the Second Intermediate Period, a new technology in warfare appeared throughout the entirety of the eastern Mediterranean: the chariot. Drawn by 2 horses, the light vehicle, which was merely a wooden platform with a low guard on 2 wheels with spokes, allowed an archer to approach the enemy's troops and rain arrow fire on them. It did come, however, with its drawbacks. The archer himself had little protection, only a shield bearer who likely used a spear to ward off attackers. The chariot itself was fragile, and it could only be used on very level terrain. Otherwise, it could be encumbered by rocks. However, its impact was enormous. Rapidly, every state in the Eastern Mediterranean adopted a territory into their own military, and Egypt was no exception. Though it was definitely slower compared to its contemporary rivals, perhaps only adopting it during the 19th dynasty, though the king himself rode the battle in chariots from the very beginning of the new kingdom, as the first representations of horses and chariots in Egyptian art appear in the funerary temple of Ahmose, the first king of the 18th dynasty. The charioteers were extremely wealthy themselves, seeing as they provided their own equipment. The core of the army was professional, and they seem to have had extremely long military careers. Some biographies of the early 18th dynasty cover certain military services lasting over 50 years. But there were incentives for this. Men could climb the ranks and attain positions in civil and religious administration at the end of their service. Military men were prominent throughout Egyptian society in general. They could even become kings, as demonstrated by the last king of the 18th dynasty, Horemheb, who did not attain the throne through inheritance but as a general. The expansionist policy of the new kingdom also led to a bureaucratic expansion. In order to administer new territories, Egyptians settled in both Nubia and Syria to represent the state, while back home, the bureaucracy needed its own branch to deal with foreign affairs. Its beginning from the conquest of Avaris began the expansionist policy of the new kingdom. The very first king of the 18th dynasty, Ahmose, was not satisfied with the reunification of the kingdom and would begin an expansion beyond its natural borders with a campaign in southern Palestine. He was the first conquering king, and he would not be the last. In fact, the first 6 rulers of the 18th dynasty would conduct military campaigns beyond the natural borders of Egypt. And Ahmose's campaigns would not stop there. He also campaigned into Nubia, though the conquest of the Kushites would only come after him. The kingdom of Kush would be dealt with over the next 2 decades. Though Amenhotep I would too campaign in Nubia, it would be his successor, Thutmose I, who would give the kingdom of Kush its final blow. The Egyptians would devastate the capital city of Kerma, hacking its monuments to pieces, and establishing in its place a much smaller city. His troops would also march further upstream, into a place called Kurgus, lying between the 4th and 5th cataracts of the Nile. The location was of strategic importance, as it gave access to desert routes to its north. The final subjugation of Nubia would eventually come during the reign of the 5th king of the 18th dynasty, Thutmose III, as he would spend much of his reign destroying any opposition to Egyptian rule in the northern part of Upper Nubia. And his goal, brutal as it may have been, was successful. Egypt's hold on the region became so secure that his successors would set up in place a system of government that would last for the rest of the new kingdom. Although the Nubians would eventually adopt Egyptian customs, the Egyptians themselves did not consider them as their compatriots. It's also worth noting that the Egyptian rule over Nubia depended on each region. The deeper into the Nile the territory was, the less direct Egyptian rule was, as beyond the 3rd cataract, daily affairs were left to Nubian princes, who acted as vassals to the Egyptian crown. Only when they did not fulfill their obligations would the Egyptian army intervene. Up from the 3rd cataract, Nubia was ruled directly as an Egyptian province. The Egyptian interest in Nubia seems to have been, for the most part, economic, with the aim to extract as many resources as possible. The greatest contribution Nubia had to the Egyptian economy was most likely gold. The mines of Wawat, in particular, were located in remote places, and their exploitation was very difficult, even deadly for many of its workers. No description of their work from the New Kingdom exists, but seeing as the mines were still in use as late as the Ptolemaic period, those accounts give us some idea. To the Egyptians, however, it was worth the trouble. It provided the necessary gold for gilded monuments such as obelisks and for certain grave goods. Tutankhamun's inner gold coffin alone weighs 243 pounds, that is 110 kilograms. It also meant that Egypt had in effect a monopoly on the metal in the Eastern Mediterranean trade. While the areas between the First and Third Cataract had little agricultural value, with mining being the only major economic enterprise, from the Third Cataract onward the valley widened and allowed for farming and cattle raising. By the end of Thutmose III's reign, Nubia had been largely pacified, and Egypt's control over this important province would last for some 300 years. The political conditions in Western Asia were very different from Nubia. The Kingdom of Kush represented a centralized opposition to Egyptian dominance, and upon its annihilation, resistance to Egyptian rule was left to disparate forces. Western Asia closer to Egypt was divided into several city-states, but an equivalent power to the New Kingdom emerged in the form of the Mitanni, which stretched from the Mediterranean coast in southern Turkey to the northeast of modern Iraq. The heartlands of the Mitanni laid beyond the Euphrates, but it controlled vassals in Syria west of the river. And so, Egypt's military actions in the region were bound to reach the Mitanni sphere of influence sooner or later. After the expulsion of the Hyksos, the early 18th dynasty continued to carry out raids along the Mediterranean coast. Thutmose I even claimed to have reached the Euphrates River, where he may have clashed against Mitanni forces. The main opponents of the Egyptian army were the small rulers who had sworn allegiance to the Mitanni king. In some places in southern Palestine, the Egyptians set up their own fortifications. Beyond that, however, they bullied local rulers into submission under the threat of military action. When Thutmose III became the sole ruler of Egypt, he changed the policy towards Western Asia. Claiming several of his vassals had rebelled against Egyptian rule, the king retaliated and the rebels sought refuge in the city of Megiddo in northern Palestine. Undeterred, the king pursued and defeated the rebels in battle and laid siege to the city for 7 months. With the defeat of the rebels, the king was free to raid further north, which he continued to do so in later years, eventually reaching the Euphrates and Mitanni-controlled land. The other states of Western Asia, namely the Hittites, Assyria, and Babylon, were so impressed by the king that they sent embassies. However, the king's campaigns did not lead to a considerable expansion in territory. Egypt held firm control only over southern Palestine, while further north, the existence of vassal states who acted quite independently of Egypt was tolerated. The military campaigns against the Mitanni would come to an end during Amenhotep II's reign. His successor, Thutmose IV, would conclude a peace treaty with the Syrian kingdom, even marrying a Mitanni princess. This change in diplomatic stance favored both countries. On one hand, the Mitanni were beginning to feel the rising pressure from the Hittites and Assyrians to their north and east. On the other, Egypt was free to exploit the rich regions of southern Syria and Palestine, importing vast amounts of luxury products, as well as some agricultural goods. It could tap more easily into the trade network of the Eastern Mediterranean, which gave access to products from northern Syria as well as the Aegean world. As a result of Egypt's wars in Syria and Palestine, the country's contacts with the cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean vastly intensified. In the past, Egypt had always been in contact with the regions of Anatolia, Western Asia, and the Aegean, but it rose to unprecedented heights during the New Kingdom. Notably, it influenced the Egyptian elite, which gained access to foreign goods and ideas, which set them apart from the rest of the population. There was thus an influx of foreign luxury goods into Egypt, which affected production. Among the imports were vessels and ingots of glass from northern Syria and Assyria. The Egyptians would also recruit immigrant glassmakers to set up their own production, though it would always remain limited. The borrowing from Syria also included certain gods. Those could be attached to an important technology. And so, as the Egyptians imported a chariot, the war goddess Astarte was associated with it. Syria's leading deity, the storm god Baal, also found its adherents in Egypt. Literary tales about him started to appear in Egypt during the reign of Amenhotep II. Influence from the Minoans also appeared in this period. Minoans were found represented on tombs from the period, and at the same time, Minoan pottery appeared in several Egyptian sites, and it's clear that the art from that region had a strong impact on the country. In the opposite direction from the Aegean, early New Kingdom Egyptians were in contact with a land they called Punt. They reached it via the sea and found it a land very unlike their own. The representations of houses, animals, and plants suggest a location in northeast Africa along the Red Sea coast, possibly the region of modern Eritrea, although a locale farther inland has also been suggested. Punt had been a destination for Egyptian expeditions ever since the 5th dynasty, but it was during the New Kingdom that it received unprecedented attention. Among the goods Egypt imported were complete incense trees, as well as loose incense. These expeditions opened up trade routes with sub-Saharan Africa and also brought Egypt access to exotic goods such as elephant ivory, ebony, and wild animal skins. The unprecedented military expansion during the 18th dynasty may lead to the assumption that the transition of power from one pharaoh to the next was smooth and straightforward. However, that was not the case, as several times during the 18th dynasty, the new king was either a minor or not a son of the pharaoh's main wife. The first of these was more common than the latter, and in this case, the king's mother would have to rule as regent until the king's seniority. The most difficult case in regards to succession is related to one of the few female pharaohs of the entire history of Egypt, Hatshepsut. Her ascension to the throne was not without controversy, seeing as she took on the royal titles when the king of Egypt was her minor stepson. She changed her portrayals in statues and relief sculptures in order to appear more masculine. Hatshepsut also alleged she had freed Egypt from Asiatic rule when, in fact, that had been accomplished almost 80 years before her reign. She would rule Egypt for about 15 years, but she would disappear in the 22nd regnal year of her stepson's reign, most likely because she died. Said stepson, Thutmose III, would rule for 3 more decades, and he would eventually have her names and images removed from the numerous monuments she had erected. Many New Kingdom rulers today are famous because of their tombs. Plenty of tourists go to Egypt to visit the Valley of the Kings, hidden in the mountains west of the Nile. Its most recognized king, a certain Tutankhamun, owes his popularity solely to the rich finds in his tomb, the only one ancient robbers had left behind. Its riches likely paled in comparison to the other tombs. The burial of kings and queens in the valley was an innovation of the 18th dynasty. Its first king commissioned the last royal pyramid of Egypt, a relatively modest one in Abydos, though it was a cenotaph and his real tomb was most likely in Thebes. His successor, Amenhotep I, may have introduced a new practice that would remain the rule for the rest of the new kingdom, that being the separation of the funerary complex from the tomb, most likely to protect the tomb from being looted, as it would be located in a hidden place. The funerary temples were prominent and close to the cultivated zone on the west bank. Of these, Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahri is the most famous example. As a queen, she chose to be buried in the earliest royal tomb we can confidently identify in the Valley of the Kings. The Egyptian pharaohs would choose this location as their place of burial for the next 500 years. Also in western Thebes, separated from the Valley of the Kings, were hundreds of tomb officials from the New Kingdom. Their decoration and inscriptions provide a rich source of information for the duties and powers of the Egyptian bureaucracy. Though Thebes remained as the capital of the New Kingdom, it's possible that Memphis was just as, if not more important, for administrative purposes, as the Egyptian pharaohs spent much of their time there. We only happen to know more of the Theban administrators because more of their tombs have been uncovered. Many offices of the civil administration were divided into north and south. The highest administrators were the viziers of north and south. The office represented royal interests in every aspect of the bureaucracy and supervised all official state activity. Their recorded actions were mostly judicial in nature, where they would settle disputes, answer petitions, and authorize transfers of property. In the nomes, now without nomarchs, local leadership was responsible for economic and governmental affairs and reported back to their corresponding vizier. A large bureaucracy was also attached to the army, a necessity stemming from the fact that the Egyptian military had become larger and more professional. This bureaucracy also extended to religious matters, which flourished from the Egyptian conquests, most notably those of Thebes, as, for example, the temple of Amun had doubled in size. The conquests of the early 18th dynasty brought an enormous amount of wealth into Egypt, and so it is no surprise that its kings used part of that wealth to fund the construction of monuments, as kings of the past had done so before. The funerary temples and tombs on the west bank of Thebes are only one of such those examples. Kings also commissioned the renovation and enlargement of temples, as well as grand palaces and residences for the court to live and work in. The archaeological evidence available is very biased towards Thebes, but it is also assumed the city of Memphis also prospered equally under this period. Other cities also received royal attention, such as Gurob at the region of Fayum and the former capital of Hyksos, Avaris. And so, the early 18th dynasty initiated a new period of prosperity and grandeur for Egypt. The state was expansionist and eager to extract resources from its neighbors. It was in contact with distant cultures, from which it received exotic gifts. The wealth generated enabled numerous state dependents in the civil, military, and religious branches of government to live in luxury and to expend many resources on their tombs. The kings at the center of this flourishing organization built grand palaces and temples and displayed themselves as great conquerors and agents to the gods. In all these ways, the early 18th dynasty established a rule that would remain in place all the way to the end of the New Kingdom. After 150 years of constant warfare and expansion, Egypt had secured its international position, and military campaigns had subsided. The new kingdom had expanded beyond its traditional territory and into Libya, Palestine, Syria, and Nubia. For most of the 14th century BCE, only a few campaigns in Nubia would go underway. In Western Asia, attitudes shifted from hostile interactions to coexistence with its great counterparts. Diplomacy dominates the record of Egyptians' foreign relations in the late 18th dynasty. While foreign relations were peaceful, internally, the late 18th dynasty will reveal itself to be a turbulent period for the country, particularly in the intellectual and religious aspects. Kings Amenhotep III and IV, the latter of which would change his name to Akhenaten, would upset traditional ideas about their own position in the universe, as well as the hierarchy of the gods. Both would express their new ideas through the creation of buildings and monuments made possible by the empire's newly found wealth and prosperity. The latter of the two in particular caused deep divisions within society. This highly controversial Egyptian pharaoh promoted Aten, who previously had been only an aspect of the sun god, to a level of worship that excluded all other gods. If his ideas were in fact monotheistic, it would be the first documented example of such a religious position in the history of the world. That many in Egypt deeply resented his religious reforms is more than clear from the reactions after his death. Subsequent upheavals led to the end of the 18th dynasty, as well as the removal of Akhenaten's name and monuments. Kings and courtiers of the late 18th dynasty left an enormous amount of remains, including some of the most famous of the entirety of Egyptian history. The most renowned of these is the tomb of Tutankhamun, but there's also other tombs, hundreds of statues, extensive building remains, and more. The kings and events of this period have drawn the attention of many, both Egyptologists and beyond. The late 18th dynasty is probably the most famous and discussed period in all of ancient Egypt's history. When Amenhotep III built his massive mortuary temple, he expressed an unrealistic yet traditional Egyptian view of the world, namely, that he was master of all other countries. On bases that originally held statues were carved images of bound prisoners with the names of the countries they represented. One base lists the great states of Babylon, Mitanni, Carchemish, Aleppo, Hatti, Arzawa, and Assyria. A second, minor states of Syria and Palestine. A third, badly damaged, named states from the Syrio-Palestinian corridor. A fourth, seemingly again great states of the north, and a fifth, states in Greece and the Aegean. However, in reality, Egypt's domination of the world was fictitious. Amenhotep III, like other Egyptian pharaohs of the time, had to engage with the great kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean as equals. We know the real situation through a series of correspondences we call the Amarna letters. The Amarna letters fall into two groups. The larger groups involves Egypt's relations with its vassals in Syria and Palestine, while the smaller concerns states that are of equal status to Egypt at the time. Its rulers saw themselves as brothers and treated one another with respect. They form an exclusive group, which modern scholars have called the Club of Great Powers, whose membership was jealously guarded. During the days of the Amarna letters, the kingdoms that were members of this club alongside Egypt were Babylon, whose language was that of diplomacy, Mitanni, the major power in North Syria, the Hittites, who had recently united most of Anatolia and started to encroach on northern Syria, Al-Ashia, a state from the island of Cyprus and was valued because of its copper mines, and Arzawa, a poorly known state from southern Anatolia. In the time span of the Amarna letters, Assyria too would force its way into this club via its military successes, much to Babylon's dismay. The Egyptian rulers corresponded with their colleagues in a formulaic language, inquiring at length about their well-being and those close to them. The actual messages were usually brief and did not involve issues of policy, but of courtesy. Once, for example, the king of Babylon moved to a new palace and invited the pharaoh to the opening ceremony. It was unthinkable that the ruler of Egypt would ever make such a journey, but the invitation had to be extended. There was also a practical reason behind this practice. The constant exchange of gifts demonstrated what types of trade goods each kingdom had. Due to this habit, it became clear Egypt, for example, had in effect a monopoly on gold due to its Nubian conquests, a metal which was highly coveted by the other great kings. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal even wrote to the Egyptian king, demonstrating jealousy at the sheer abundance of gold which the pharaoh's kingdom possessed. Princesses were part of this exchange as well, but Egypt took a different stance, which was resented by its neighbors. No Egyptian princess would marry abroad, though the pharaoh himself was free to enjoy the brides proposed to him by foreign powers. The majority of the Amarna letters document Egyptian interactions with their vassals in Syria and Palestine. Almost all letters written to the Egyptian court were not composed in their overlord's language, but rather Babylonian. The correspondence is very different from that which dealt with their equal powers, as the vassals demonstrate a constant state of quibbling and rivalries against each other, with local rulers begging for Egyptian support against the other. The control Egypt had over this region was relatively loose. Local men continued to govern as kings in their respective city-state, but as subjects of Egypt. In total, some 60 city-states survived under Egyptian supervision, which was enforced by small garrisons of troops. Egypt used this region as both a buffer with its northern equals of Hatti and Mitanni, as well as a source of tribute, mainly agricultural goods. The region itself was divided into 3 zones: Amurru on the northern coast, Apu in inland Syria, and Canaan on the southern coast. Each had a center, in which an Egyptian commissioner administrated the area. It is through this correspondence in which we see how the local rulership saw its Egyptian overlords as a potential tool for their ambitions, as they constantly wrote to the king, painting themselves as loyal vassals, while this or other local king was treacherous. The largest preserved group of the Amarna letters derives from Rib-Adda, the king of Byblos. He accused the kings of Amurru of threatening his city with military action because he was loyal to Egypt, while they supported the Hittites. At some point, the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten sent a general to investigate the matter, but Rib-Adda was blamed for the trouble. Eventually, Rib-Adda himself would betray Egypt and officially align with the Hittites. Scholars used to read these messages and consider them as evidence that Akhenaten lost interest in its foreign territories, but that is probably a mistake. Local rulers painted dire situations because they thought it would convince the pharaoh to give them support against their local rivals. But the Egyptian king was not interested in the local affairs of these rulers and tolerated their rivalries as long as his access to the region's resources was safe. Both the Amarna letters and evidence outside Egypt indicate that the political situation of Syria was far from static. Under King Suppiluliuma I, the Hittites of central Anatolia massively expanded their territory. Their territorial expansion was at the expense of the Mitanni, as the king annexed all Mitanni-held territory west of the Euphrates and made its king his vassal. Hittite control over northwestern Syria placed it in competition against Egypt, who claimed supremacy over its city-states. Some vassals, such as Kadesh and Amuru, changed their allegiance from Egypt to Hatti. In response, Egypt may have mounted an expedition under the reign of Tutankhamun, with little effect. The struggle over Syria would dominate Egyptian foreign politics for the next 60 years. Hostilities were briefly interrupted, however, by one of the strangest political events of the age. The Hittite king had received a message from an Egyptian queen, recently widowed and childless. The queen had asked the Hittite king to marry one of his sons. Initially, Suppiluliuma was suspicious, but when informed the request was legitimate, he did send his son, Zananza, to marry the queen. But the Hittite prince was promptly assassinated. In revenge, Suppiluliuma began a campaign against Egypt in Syria. The identity of this queen is unknown, but almost certainly she was the wife of either Akhenaten or Tutankhamun. When Amenhotep III inherited his father's throne, the state he ruled over stretched from northern Syria to Sudan. Further expansion was not his concern. The official record mentioned only 2 campaigns into Nubia, which were perhaps more ceremonial in nature than to deal with rebellious groups, and they were carried out by his officers, not the king himself. In Western Asia, Amenhotep III followed his father's policy of resuming peaceful relations with the Mitanni. The aggressive militarism of the early 18th dynasty had come to an end. Amenhotep III sponsored more building activity than anyone else in his dynasty, and only the later King Ramses II left behind more architectural remains. The most famous of his commissions were the so-called Colossi of Memnon. These statues have survived into the modern age. The architectural works he commissioned were connected to the changes in the king's relationship to the gods that became clear in his reign. Amenhotep III took the idea of self-deification further than any previous pharaoh, and was the first king to present himself as divine during his lifetime. Some representations show him making offerings to his image as a god. He was no longer merely the son of Ra, but rather the radiant solar disk. He was to be venerated as the personification of other gods. His wife, the Queen Tiye, was very important in this ideological change. It was highly unusual for the couple to be both buried in the Valley of the Kings. Many statues represent Tiye at her husband's side at equal size. No queen of Egypt had ever received so much attention. It is believed by many scholars she had great influence over the king and was involved in the daily aspects of his rule. Due to his long, prosperous reign, building projects, and self-deification, it is no surprise that Amenhotep III is known as the Sun King. But he would die in the 38th year of his rule. Not that old, since he became the Egyptian pharaoh as a child. The new king, Amenhotep IV, had not been groomed for the throne as he was a younger son. It is unknown, however, whether or not he succeeded his father as a child or if he was already an adult. Either way, Amenhotep IV would prove to be one of the most controversial figures in all Egyptian history. When the new king ascended to the throne, his official birth name was Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, thus incorporating the name of the Theban god. From early on in his reign, his main wife was a woman named Nefertiti. Tiye may have been very prominent, but she was still secondary in status to her husband. Nefertiti, on the other hand, seems to have achieved a full equal status to that of her husband, and the two are shown together in various official contexts. Most notably, They appear kissing each other, a degree of intimacy that is completely unprecedented in royal Egyptian art. In total, the couple would have 6 daughters but no son. Although Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti initially treated Thebes as Egypt's religious center, they had an unusual attitude towards the god Amun, who had been so central to Amenhotep III's royal ideology. Outside the reference in the king's birth name, the god did not appear in the royal titulary. The king commissioned the building to the east of Amun's temple at Karnak, devoted to another god, Aten, who was Ra-Orachti, essentially Ra combined with Horus, in the visible form of the solar disk. Amenhotep III had equated himself with it. Amenhotep IV would elevate it to a status above Amun. The cult of Aten would define the remainder of his reign. Queen Nefertiti placed Nefer Neferu Aten, meaning the most perfect is Aten, before her name, and an area in Aten's temple in Karnak was devoted to her alone. However, early on in his reign, Aten was still a traditional god in some respects, being depicted as a falcon-headed man with a sun disk on his head. In the 3rd to the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep's religious changes became more intense. The representations of Aten became unique for ancient Egypt, no longer merely the falcon-headed human, but a sun disk. The changes affected every aspect of life: religion, art, language, and the economy. The temples of traditional gods were closed, and their priesthood reschooled under the new ideology. These reforms cannot have been unopposed, as they would upset powerful factions within the country, certainly the priesthood at the very least, and it is believed Amenhotep relied on his army to carry out his reforms. In the 5th year, Amenhotep would abandon his birth name altogether, calling himself Akhenaten, which can mean a number of things, such as beneficial to Aten, whom Aten uses, radiance of Aten, or effective spirit of the Aten. Amun disappeared completely from the king's name and titles. The capital of Thebes was also abandoned by the king, as he founded a new city further north, called Amarna today. Being halfway between the two traditional centers of Memphis and Thebes, the king had distanced himself from the elites who had previously run the state. This new city would be named Akhetaten, meaning Horizon of Aten. It was an extremely large city, and there's no doubt its construction was possible due to Egypt's massive wealth at this point in history. With the move to Akhetaten, the king no longer simply ignored the other gods of Egypt, but actively started to persecute them, especially Amun, whose names and images he had removed. This even affected the way people wrote. Instead of using ideograms that represented a divine name, the scribes spelled its consonants phonetically. Aten was not merely the most important god, he was the only god. The great hymn of Aten honors the god as the creator of the universe and as the most important force in nature. Possibly written by Akhenaten himself, it portrays the daily cycle of the sun, as the night embodying chaos, and the day as order and happiness. The language vividly contrasts the two situations in the following passage.
When you sat in the western horizon, earth is in darkness as if in death. One sleeps in chambers, heads covered, one eye does not see another. Were we robbed of the goods that were under their heads, people would not notice it. Every lion comes out from its den, all the snakes bite. Darkness hovers and earth is silent, as the one who created all things rests in the horizon. Earth brightens when you dawn in the horizon, when you shine as Aten of daytime. As you dispel darkness, as you cast your rays, the two lands are in festivity. Awake and stand on their feet, as you have roused them, bodies are cleansed and dressed, their arms held high in adoration of your appearance. The entire land set out to work. All beasts browse on their pastures, trees and vegetation are sprouting. Birds fly from their nests, their wings greeting your ka. All flocks frisk on their feet, and all who fly up and alight, they leave when you dawn for them. Ships sail downstream, and upstream the roads lie open when you rise. The fish in the river leap before you, and your rays are in the midst of the sea.
It should not be forgotten that at this point, Akhenaten was the ruler of a vast empire, and so, by extension, Akhetaten was an imperial capital. The city contained buildings with offices of various government departments, and the country was ruled from there. The court's move to Akhetaten most likely caused sweeping changes in the country's bureaucracy. The old families from Memphis and Thebes seem to have been completely sidelined, while the king tightened his grip on the administration. He was the source of all power and wealth, and in the houses of Akhetaten, people kept small shrines in his honor. Akhenaten was not a weak king, quite the contrary. He must have been very confident in order to implement his sweeping reforms. The last years of Akhenaten's rule seem to have been in turmoil, and there is much confusion about events. Most likely, the king's desire to produce a male heir determined who he promoted. When he died, a woman, likely Nefertiti herself, temporarily held the reins of power, acting as co-regent until a son of Akhenaten, named Tutankhaten, became old enough to rule. However, she died 3 years into her co-regency. Tutankhaten, meaning the spitting image of the Aten, marks a return to the primacy of the god Amun. Soon, he would be known as the spitting image of Amun, Tutankhamun, and he left his father's city for the old administrative capital of Memphis. A stele found at Karnak declared the restoration of the traditional cults and promised the king's continued support. However, it is clear Tutankhamun was almost certainly not a strong king. Coming into the throne still a minor, for most of his reign he was under the control of adults, being first his co-regent, and after her, 2 high-ranking officials, Ai, whose wife had been Queen Nefertiti's wet nurse, and Horemheb, a military commander. The skills of the latter were essential at this point in Egyptian history, as the Hittite threat in Syria increased and Egypt had to reassert its authority on the region. Tutankhamun seems to have suffered from multiple ailments and may have needed a cane to walk. The young, fragile king did not last long, ruling only for 9 years. By complete coincidence, however, Tutankhamun could very well be the most famous ancient Egyptian figure known to the world. This was because his small tomb, which may have not even been intended as a royal tomb, was surprisingly untouched by looters, itself a sign at how insignificant it was compared to other royal tombs. When he died, the bloodline which had begun the 18th dynasty that ruled Egypt for some 175 years came to an end. It would be a high court official, Ai, who would become the next pharaoh. But he was already an old man when he came into the throne, and soon enough he was succeeded by Horemheb. He closed for good the religious policy of Akhenaten, and the cult of Aten simply became one of many cults, and Amun's prominence was restored. The previous kings, from Akhenaten to Ai, were removed from memory. In the succeeding 19th dynasty, the idea that no legitimate king existed between Amenhotep III and Horemheb developed, as records of the time suggest the 2 kings came directly after the other. Horemheb selected another general to be his successor, that being Paramesu, who did succeed Horemheb to the throne. Little is known from his reign, but he was the first king of the 19th dynasty. Adopting the title of Ramses I, he already had a son and grandson when he became the pharaoh, and so the foundations for the next Egyptian dynasty were already in place. He presented Horemheb as his ancestor and the start of a new era, continuing the removal of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ai from Egyptian records. Horemheb had started the removal of Akhenaten's name from inscriptions and began to use his many buildings as stone quarries for his own projects. The later kings of the 19th dynasty would continue this practice. However, Akhenaten had promoted his ideas long and forcefully enough that they could not be fully erased. The use of Late Egyptian as a language of literature instead of the classic Middle Egyptian persisted, and his memory did not fully vanish. As Manetho says, there were 4 kings between Amenhotep III and Horemheb. 2 of the names are likely candidates for Akhenaten. Josephus would link Akhenaten with Moses. Whatever the case, Akhenaten has captured the imagination of many, both ancient and contemporary figures alike, in many interpretations, from a pacifist to a great black African ruler, the first individual in history, a madman, or a sexual deviant, tend to be rather highly exaggerated one way or another. Akhenaten is an intriguing figure because he is mysterious. He is read under the reader's own ideas on religion, revolution, culture, and other idiosyncrasies, and so one's own preconceptions dictate what he means to those who read about him. What I believe is something that's often forgotten about a figure so mystified. Akhenaten was simply a man, a very powerful and forceful man, but just a man nonetheless. When Ramses I ascended to the throne, the connection with the 18th dynasty had been completely severed, and a new family, hailing from the north of Egypt, would rule for nearly a century. Its first ruler had, however, little time to make an impression on his subjects, lasting little more than a year as pharaoh. At this point, the political situation in Egypt had been unstable for more than 4 decades. It would come back to normalcy with the next king, Seti I. Though his reign was relatively short, lasting only about 11 years, the simple fact he already had a successor in place meant there was no unclear successor once he passed away. As a sign he started a new age of Egypt, Seti I embarked on a massive building program that would continue through his eventual successor, who was already at this point the crown prince, assisting his father. Temples that had suffered disrepair in the days of Akhenaten were restored. Seti I also initiated projects that would set the standard for the future. At the Temple of Abydos, the main cult site of Osiris, the pharaoh constructed a massive sanctuary, which would serve as his mortuary temple, but also contained 6 shrines for the major deities of Egypt. The 7th would be for the cult of the deceased king. In the decorations, Seti stressed his connection to the earlier kings of Egypt. In a corridor, he depicted himself and the crown prince making offerings to 75 earlier rulers represented by their cartouches. It was not a complete list, however, as certain recent kings were omitted as illegitimate rulers, such as Hatshepsut or Akhenaten, and the rulers of the intermediate periods were also dropped. The idea was to portray Seti's reign as a return to Egypt's previous splendor, so the omission was no surprise. When Seti I died, he was buried in the Valley of Kings. For all the many ambitious projects Seti would take, he did not last long enough to complete them. His son would have to take on his father's projects, and that he certainly did. The new pharaoh of Egypt would go down in history as perhaps the most famous historical figure in all of ancient Egyptian history. Known as Ozymandias to the Greeks, this pharaoh is also commonly considered to be the pharaoh of Egypt in the book of Exodus. He was Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. There is virtually no site untouched by the new pharaoh. He left behind more monuments than any other Egyptian king. However, in order to achieve this, he usurped works of earlier rulers and used Akhenaten's buildings as stone quarries. The new pharaoh liked to portray himself as a living god, much like Amenhotep III. All his temples in Lower Nubia express his divine self-proclamation, and some monuments in Egypt itself, though fewer, indicate a presence of the cult of the living king. The idea of Ramses being a god himself arose a few years into his rule, likely from his 8th year onward. His most ambitious project was in the creation of a new capital located in the eastern delta, nearby the old Hyksos capital of Avaris, named Pyramisi, that is, House of Ramses. The location already had a summer palace which was built by his father, but Ramses expanded on that idea with the construction of a large city spanning some 2,500 acres. The change of capital shows both this dynasty's northern roots as well as an increased focus on the Mediterranean. This move was no surprise. The presence of Asia nearby left both challenges to overcome and opportunities to take advantage of. Many interactions and exchanges were overall positives, as seen from the technological changes in glassmaking and chariots. As in the new capital, there's evidence both were done in the Asian style rather than the traditional Egyptian one. At the same time, the Hittites from Anatolia had gained ground in Syria and threatened Egyptian control over the Levant. It would be a pressing concern for Ramses II. From the beginning of the new kingdom, Egyptian armies had campaigned in the Levant, going as far north as northern Syria. These efforts eventually paid off, as by the end of the reign of Amenhotep III, Egyptian rule over the territory was secured and required no military action to maintain it. But during the final years of Akhenaten's reign, problems emerged as the Hittites managed to establish a foothold over northern Syria at the expense of the Mitanni. The Anatolian power would become a massive thorn for Egypt, as its king would continuously campaign over the region and eventually asserted their dominance as far south as Kadesh. This city had great strategic value as it controlled the crossing of 2 highways of northern Syria, the only inland road that ran from north to south along the Orontes River, and the west-east road from the northern Lebanese coast to the interior. Both Seti I and the Hittite king Mu'attali had intentions of bolstering their presence in the region. Seti I even has reliefs depicting him campaigning in Syria against both the Hittites as well as the kings of Amuru and Kadesh. The conflict escalated during the reign of Ramses II. In his 4th year, an Egyptian army marched along the Lebanese coast as far as Byblos, but no further information is provided. Whatever happened, it required the presence of the Pharaoh of Egypt himself, as next year's campaign would become the most famous episode of the entirety of Ramses II's reign, the Battle of Kadesh. 2 narratives of the battle exist. The Egyptian narrative is the far more detailed one, though the Hittite, mentioned by the king's brother, states the Hittites defeated the Egyptians. Ramses described his armies as made up of 4 divisions, each named after a god: Amun, Ptah, Ra, and Seth. Leading the Amun division, the king had received false information from 2 Hittite soldiers claiming to be deserters, who informed him that the Hittite army was near Aleppo, some 120 miles away. The Egyptian king discovered, a bit too late, that the Hittite army was in fact in Kadesh, by which point the Ra division, still in marching formation, was under attack. Panicking, the Egyptian troops fled to Ramses' camp, which was promptly surrounded. So the king broke out, single-handedly killing many enemies from his chariot. The description is rather fanciful in its praise of the king.
No officer was with me, no charioteer, no soldier of the army, no shield-bearer. My infantry, my charioteer yielded before them. Not one of them stood firm to fight with them. His Majesty spoke. What is this, my father Amun? Is it right for a father to ignore his son? What are these Asiatics to you, O Amun? These wretched ones, ignorant of God? Have I not made for you many great monuments, filling your temple with plunder? I sacrificed to you thousands of cattle and all kinds of sweet-scented herbs. Now though I prayed in the distant land, my voice reached the Thebes. I found that the god Amun came when I called him. He gave me his hand, and I rejoiced. He called from behind as if nearby, I am with you. I am your father, and my hand is with you. I prevail over 100,000 men. I am Lord of Victory who loves courage. One called out to the other, saying, No man is he who is among us. It is the god Seth, great of strength, Baal himself. The deeds of man are not his doing. They are of the one who is unique, who fights hundreds of thousands without his army and chariotry. Come quick, flee before him, to seek life and breathe air.
Students of the battle think it is more likely that auxiliary troops, depicted in the reliefs but not mentioned in the text, came to Ramses' aid. They also point out the Hittites started to loot the camp before the battle was over to explain their route. The pharaoh's account goes on to relate how he continued to fight until the Hittite king sent a letter suing for peace. Most historians regard Ramses' claim of victory with some skepticism and argue that the battle was a draw at best. For all his boasting, his later campaigns in the region only reached points farther south, and Egyptian control over Amuru and Kadesh seems to have been lost forever. It may only be the amount of attention given by Ramses which makes the Battle of Kadesh so distinct in this time period. Perhaps the king wanted to discredit the army in a power struggle, and so portrayed his soldiers as cowards he personally had to save. Perhaps the king really changed the course of battle and wanted to ensure his army's safe return. He certainly seems to have believed in this. In a later letter to the Hittite king Hattusili III, he repeats the idea that he was cheated and that he single-handedly won the battle. However, the battle itself is also special due to the fact it was the first major battle in which both kings were present, a rarity at the time, which highlights just how important both kings considered this campaign to be. Furthermore, the Hittites broke many rules of war. They did not issue a challenge nor attack frontally. Normally, attackers and defenders played set roles, but the Hittites reversed those and used subterfuge. The Battle of Kadesh was a sign of breakdown in the expected diplomatic and military behavior of the time. 3 years after the Battle of Kadesh, Muwatalli died and the Hittite kingdom fell into a struggle between two brothers, Urhi-Teshub and Hattusili. The latter would prevail, while the former would flee to Egypt. But Ramses II did not take advantage of the situation. In fact, both kings would conclude a peace treaty and defensive alliance. Both royal houses were interested in a long-lasting peace, as both promised to help each other whenever threatened. Should an outsider attack one party, the other had to send military support, and both pledged assistance against local rebellions. Hattusili also included a special clause that demanded Ramses would support his designated successor. This promise of mutual support was not merely words on paper. Hittite charioteers were stationed in Paramessi, and Egyptian soldiers may have been stationed in Hatti in return. The motivation for the treaty was unknown to Egypt, but it was clear from the Hittite end. The Hittite king wanted to obtain Egyptian support against a highly aggressive and expansionist Assyria, who had conquered the Mitanni. Egyptian administration in Syria and Palestine had been relatively loose during the 18th dynasty. Local vassals were responsible for carrying out imperial orders, and only a few Egyptian administrators were involved. The military presence in the region was also fairly limited after the conquest. This would end under Ramses II. Egyptian presence was intensified, with the construction of officials' residences and military garrisons, transforming its most strategically important towns into fortresses. It would seem locals accepted Egyptian culture at large, as archaeological remains indicate that local traditions grew fainter. It would seem Egypt had annexed the region. However, Egypt's reach of control was much smaller than before, being limited to Palestine, while southern Syria seems to have been left alone. This policy was replicated in Lower Nubia. Though imperial presence had tightened even under the reign of Seti I, Ramses II would build on this, going as far as building a large sanctuary for Amun near the Fourth Cataract. There was relatively little military activity in the region, however, as Nubia had been under Egypt's control for more than 200 years at this time. A new area of concern for Egypt was the Western Desert. Being sparsely inhabited by nomadic groups, it had been the setting for military activity from the very beginning of the Egyptian state, but it doesn't seem as if it was considered a great danger. After almost no mention of these people from the 18th dynasty, Seti I would report military activity there. Under Ramses II, the number of clashes in this region intensified, and his building activity in particular shows that he saw its inhabitants as a threat, laying out a string of fortresses along the western edge of the delta, intended to monitor the movement of herdsmen from areas farther west into the delta. So Ramses II had strengthened all the borders of Egypt with fortified structures in order to ensure Egyptian presence and dominance. Of course, it did come with the drawback that the total area under Egyptian control was more restricted in size than previously. After the peace treaty with the Hittites, these defenses were not needed against the great state, being intended for less organized opponents, those from regions around Egypt who saw the Nile as a place to start a new and better life. The early 19th dynasty may thus have had a siege mentality, surrounding Egypt with border fences, where they could control entry into the country. But as all governments who adopt this policy sooner or later find out, it's virtually impossible to close off land where others want to settle. Egypt's wealth and stability was very appealing to outsiders. Furthermore, Egyptian policy itself throughout the New Kingdom promoted the influx of foreigners, and so it's hardly surprising they influenced society in many ways, even more so as this was not a new phenomenon, going back as far as the Old Kingdom and maybe even before. Though official rhetoric depicted foreigners as lesser than Egyptians, it was primarily through foreign labor that the numerous building projects were constructed. The army also recruited its fair share as, for example, the Sherden, who Ramses II campaigned against, would fight for the Egyptian army as mercenaries. The population became more diverse as a result, and ethnic neighborhoods developed. Memphis had its own Hittite neighborhood. The presence of foreigners, which existed in all levels of society, caused a profound change on the Egyptian language in the New Kingdom. Hundreds of Semitic words were transcribed into a special syllabic form of Egyptian script. Military terms make up the largest group, showing the importance of Asiatic soldiers in the Egyptian army, but there were also terms for crafts, objects, foods, and the like. The immigrants also influenced Egyptian religion. Several new Asiatic cults entered the country, often with royal support. Among these were the Syrian god Reshep and the goddess Astarte, as gods of the war chariot. The Syrian storm god Baal entered the official Egyptian cult in the 19th dynasty. These gods were integrated in the Egyptian pantheon and were often connected to Egyptian gods. Anat and Astarte as partners of the god Seth, and Astarte as the daughter of Ptah. Baal was associated with Seth himself and could take on a whole array of Seth's attributes. This influence on religion was reflected in literature, as the Syrian gods appear in a number of contemporary sources. The vast empire Ramses II ruled over required a massive bureaucracy. In Egyptian ideology, officials received their appointment from the king in person. So, at least in theory, Ramses handed out posts to many people over his long reign of 67 years. These high positions came with big rewards, so those who held them could build themselves lavish tombs and commission statues, steles, and other objects, which were regularly inscribed. The structure of Ramses II's government was a continuation of the earlier New Kingdom practices. It consisted of three major units: the internal government of Egypt, the relatively powerless administration of the dynasty, and the government of conquests. The internal government was divided into four sectors: the administration of royal domains, the army, the religious government, and the civil government. The latter of these supervised agricultural production, collected taxes, provided justice, and maintained order through its police force. It had a northern and southern division due to the country's size and high level of economic activity. Its main challenge was to coordinate interactions between the central administration and villages, which relied on a communal organization of justice and other matters. While local affairs were usually handled internally, individuals sometimes tried to subvert the course of justice by appealing directly to government officials, and so accusations of corruption were not uncommon. But Egypt had a legal system that relied on written documentation as well as oral testimony, and could involve long-running litigation. Since the state was so important in every aspect of Egyptian life, many people owed their livelihood to it, as administrators, priests, soldiers, laborers, and so on. Individuals could make careers in these professions, and some biographies show how they rose through the ranks. This made the Egyptians see the crown as their benefactor and created a special bond between the king and his people. However, it also made the state responsible for the well-being of a large part of the population, which would cause dissatisfaction with it when it failed to live up to expectations. After 67 years on the throne, Ramses II would die. He would be buried in the Valley of the Kings. Modern examinations of his mummy led to the discovery of an abscess by his teeth, which was serious enough to have caused death by infection, though this cannot be conclusively determined. He was about 90 years old. It's difficult to fathom how the Egyptian population would take the news of such an event. It's extremely likely most of the population knew no other pharaoh but Ramses II. There were certainly people who were born, grew up, then grew old and died, all within the span of the old king's reign. He had been one of, if not the greatest pharaoh the kingdom had ever known. But at the very least, Egypt was a strong nation, and the prospect of the country falling into ruin must have been inconceivable for most Egyptians. And, for the immediate future, this was true. Yet, the march of time is relentless. When Ramses II died, the country he left behind seems to have been in good shape. Egypt was secured with its fortified borders. It was at peace with the other great powers, and economically it was strong. 140 years later, it was in ruins. Foreign rulers no longer treated it with respect, and politically, the country was divided. 140 years is a long time, so it is no surprise that conditions vary dramatically. However, the problems Egypt faced were so remarkable, it is a surprise the New Kingdom state even lasted as long as it did. Even if there were moments of recovery, Egypt had to go through civil wars, robberies of tombs and temples, embezzlement of state resources, and, not least of all, the collapse of the international order. It's always difficult to interpret the collapse of a state, but it is clear that the end of the New Kingdom had internal and external causes, feeding on each other. Egypt was not alone in this. The entire Eastern Mediterranean network, established at the very beginning of the New Kingdom, the same system that had shaped the lives of people over a wide area for centuries, collapsed. A papyrus from this time depicts a distressing situation. Viziers accepted bribes, people abused their positions, and tomb robberies were acknowledged. The vizier who heard the accusations worked under Seti II, the grandson of Ramses II. His ascension was not without trouble, as he had to fight a civil war to secure his role. Many elements are uncertain, and scholars differ in their interpretation of events, but it is clear that the 19th dynasty is rife with succession issues. When Seti died, a young boy named Sapta became king. His father is unknown, though his mother is of Canaanite origin. The presence of foreign women in the court was not new, but Sapta's dependence on Asiatic support seems to have been greater than before. The real kingmaker was a man named Bysse, a butler in Seti II's court, who referred to himself as a foreigner from that northern land. He regularly appeared alongside the king and on the same scale in official representations, and even started building himself a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. But he flew too close to the sun, as the king he had installed had him executed. Sapta himself left no successor, and the country descended into chaos. A new entire dynasty would step in to restore order. A man of unknown origin, named Seth-Nacht, became king. In an inscription, he claimed the god Ra had chosen him to rule. Later texts depict a dire situation when he ascended to the throne, as does a stele which he set up in Elephantine, in which he accused earlier kings of having given away gold and silver to Asiatics. The return to order harkened back to the days of Ramses II, which was stressed by the entire dynasty as they would assume the name. After Seth-Nacht, Ramses III through the 11th ruled in succession. However, too many competing interests seem to have existed at court. Ramses III himself was the victim of an intrigue plotted in his own household, the so-called harem conspiracy. A secondary wife wanted her son to become heir in preference to Amun-her-Khopshef, the chosen one by Ramses. Enlisting the help of people within the pharaoh's circle, they successfully killed the king. But the throne would not fall to the desired prince. Ramses IV, Amun-her-Khopshef's brother, would rise to the throne. He would have the conspirators either executed or forced to commit suicide. One, interestingly enough, was released. After Ramses III, documentation on the court becomes scarce. The next 8 kings all used Ramses alongside their birth name. Most of their reigns were short, though Ramses IX ruled for nearly 2 decades. The late New Kingdom is full of stories of corruption, briberies, and economic volatility. Since so many people depended on the state for their income during the New Kingdom, downturns in the central economy had serious effects all over society. Records from the village Deir el Medina show there were several problems with payments going back to the early 20th dynasty. Workers protested they had not received their salaries, which were food rations for 2 months. This episode detailing the failure of the state in fulfilling its duties to its subjects is merely just one of many. The inability of the state to provide for its dependents must have done major harm to the royal image. In Egyptian ideology, the king was the source of all wealth for the people, and for close to 400 years, the success of the new kingdom had guaranteed that he could spread prosperity. When he became unable to do so during the 20th dynasty, the sense of order vanished. The reasons for the state's economic failure were likely multiple and the result of various challenges that fed upon one another. The loss of Egypt's foreign territories, which we will later get into, was one cause of the economic decline. Corruption may have aggravated the situation, as bribery and embezzlement was common, as well as crime. The economic power had also shifted from secular to religious. As the son of the founder of the new dynasty, Ramses III may have wanted to bolster his position by seeking priestly support. And his royal benefactions were truly staggering. He had donated possibly 15% of all agricultural land in the country to the Temple of Amun at Thebes. He also gave what may have amounted to 3% of the entire population of Egypt. Many scholars believe that after his donations, temples owned 1/3 of all the land in Egypt. If he truly sought the support of the priestly class, it came with a high price, as the loss of agricultural properties and manpower severely weakened his ability to commission and pay for public projects. It is no surprise then that the priesthood of Amun was extremely powerful during this period, even to the point it actively participated in state policy. The loss of the king's status in society was thus acute, and explains why there was such a breakdown of order in the late New Kingdom. The relatively short reigns of the rulers likely exacerbated the issue. They were mostly middle-aged men who ruled only for a few years, and so had no real chance to reassert their power. From the 19th dynasty onward, the pressure of outside groups had grown to such an extent that the official record portrayed them as a real danger. When Ramses II surrounded Egypt's border with fortifications, he did not report any wars against nomadic groups. That became an issue in the description of two of his successors, Meremptah and Ramses III, who, several decades apart, reported difficulties against the Libyans and the new group, which is referred to as the Sea Peoples. In his 5th year, Meremptah reported a great invasion of people led by Mereye, chief of the Libyans, and including a coalition of people he said came from the countries of the sea in the north, Ekwesh, Teresh, Luka, Serden, and Shekelesh. The pharaoh's pride in defeating them is displayed on the temple walls of Karnak. 3 decades later, Ramses III reported similar events, occurring throughout different years of his reign, but most prominently during his 8th. He too celebrated a great victory against them.
As for the foreign countries, they made a conspiracy in their isles. No land could stand before their arms, from Hatzi, Kode, Kartsesmich, Yereth, and Yeres. A camp was set up in one place in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming, while the flame was prepared before them, forward towards Egypt. Their confederation was the Palaset, Jeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh, lands united. They laid their hands upon the lands to the very circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting, our plans will succeed. As for those who reached my frontier, their seed is not. Their heart and their soul are finished forever and ever.
Both pharaohs present these attacks as sudden events, but several of the names of the Sea Peoples appeared in Egyptian records decades earlier, serving as mercenaries for both Egyptian and Hittite armies in the Battle of Kadesh. Likewise, it seems that Ramses III integrated many Libyans in his army after their attack. Colonies of Libyans appeared in the Delta. Their inhabitants would gain great political influence during the Third Intermediate Period. It's hard to connect the records to the events observed in the archaeological and textual record of the wider Eastern Mediterranean. Ramses III claimed no one could stand before the Sea Peoples, and his list of obliterated sites include Al-Ashia in Cyprus, which actually flourished at the time. However, it is clear this was an eventful period in the region, and several cities and states did in fact disappear. The Hittites abandoned Hattusa, and the rich arbor city of Ugarit ceased to exist. But in truth, the Egyptians were unsure about what happened beyond their borders. Egypt's ignorance of what happened in the north was due to, in large part, of the collapse of the international system that had existed for centuries. The usual flow of information was interrupted when diplomatic contacts stopped because partners like the Hittite state disappeared around 1200 BCE. This system had supported the status of the Egyptian elites both home and abroad. With this international diplomacy coming to a halt, luxury goods from elsewhere no longer came into Egypt. This rather abrupt fall of the Near East's political system has itself a name: the Bronze Age collapse. The semi-arid Transjordan and Upper Mesopotamian plateaus reverted to a predominantly nomadic lifestyle. Syria and Anatolia experienced the abandonment of large cities, and settlements began to be concentrated in the fertile valleys. In central and southern Mesopotamia, the population was virtually halved. The Bronze Age collapse is a topic unto its own, and if it's to be discussed, it should be given its own appropriate installment. The key point to take away here is, the fall of the political system did affect Egypt. Egypt depended on the south of the Syro-Palestinian corridor for mineral resources. For its entire history, mines in the Sinai Desert had provided access to copper and semi-precious stone, such as turquoise. These expeditions stopped. Somewhat later, Egypt lost control over Nubia, whose viceroy became an independent actor. His intervention in Egypt would mark the end of the new kingdom. Throughout the 20th dynasty, problems mounted for the Egyptian kings. The brevity of many reigns and loss of status to the benefit of the priesthood of Amun meant their hold on power had weakened. Foreign territories slipped out of control, and the economy was in decline, making it hard for the state to support its dependents. These trends culminated in the reign of Ramses XI, which reigned for a relatively long 29 years, but saw the political fragmentation of his country. The volatile situation around Thebes had reached new levels. The countryside was insecure, tomb robberies increased, and there may have been a famine. Perhaps in an attempt to bring back order, the viceroy of Kush marched his troops into Thebes, which led to a dispute between him and the high priest of Amun. The pharaoh sent his general Herihor to relieve the high priest, and a civil war ensued. Herihor would defeat the viceroy of Kush and took over his titles. After acquiring the titles of vizier and high priest of Amun, he was the de facto ruler of southern Egypt. From his conquests, the 21st dynasty began, acting in opposition of the 20th. The new kingdom was gone, and the third intermediate period had begun. It was the last of the three great Egyptian golden ages. Never again would Egypt return to the heights it once achieved. For the rest of its history, ancient Egypt would go back and forth between being an independent local power or ruled by foreigners. The names modern scholars use to designate periods in the history of Egypt impacts how they are perceived. This is especially true for the centuries that followed the New Kingdom, when Egypt was no longer an empire and had lost its international strength. The chapters of the country's history, written by Egyptologist Wolfgang Helck, were displayed as if it were a battle of survival against foreign rule. But it's foolish to see a millennia, from the end of the New Kingdom to the final days of the Ptolemaic dynasty, as a mere epilogue of Egyptian history. The following times were a fundamental change in the country, and the homogeneity of earlier times did disappear. More often than not, non-Egyptians dominated political life, and although they adopted many customs of Egyptian culture, they did not hide their foreign origins. Egypt seems at times to have been the plaything, caught in the midst of struggling foreign powers, but its customs usually influenced their behavior. Culture showed a great deal of hybridity, combining elements of Egypt's past with those introduced by newcomers. This long period after the New Kingdom was just as much a part of the ancient civilization as any of the preceding periods, and it has to be taken into account if we are to truly appreciate the country's history. The third intermediate period is not an easy one to grasp. The concept of royal dynasties continued, but in reality, various bases of power coexisted, and kingship itself was perceived differently from before. Power, like in the other intermediate periods, was fragmented, but was much more peaceful in comparison. It was not a period of chaos. Lasting for over 3 centuries, it constitutes an important stage in the country's evolution, where local and foreign formed a new society. Unfortunately, there's little historical material for this period. No king list exists except for Manetho's. He only took the rulers of the Delta into account, and our modern designation of the Third Intermediate Period comprises 4 or 5 of his dynasties. All scholars include in the period dynasties 21 through 24, all with different capitals. Alongside them existed other centers of power, such as the high priests of Amun and the Libyan chiefs. Some scholars also include the 25th dynasty, but others attribute it to the late period. The Third Intermediate Period would come to an end at around 750 BCE, when the Nubian king Pierre took control of Upper Egypt, beginning what would be the 25th dynasty. The country would come under full Nubian control 10 years later, when his successor, Shabako, annexed Lower Egypt. The reasons for doing so related to the new international situation of the time. The Near East had entered an age of empires, and Egypt's fate depended on the actions of others. It was particularly the Neo-Assyrian Empire which was the source for so much worry. And it was indeed the competition between both the empire from Mesopotamia and Nubia that dominated events in Egypt for about a decade in the 7th century. Stuck in the middle between these two competing powers, the local Egyptians ultimately decided the Assyrians were the better choice. Assyrian policy was to control distant regions by putting locals in charge of the administration and forcing them to pay tribute. Subjugating Egypt, the Assyrians would initially rely on the old families that had ruled the country in the Third Intermediate Period. However, local Egyptian power repeatedly resisted Assyrian rule. After many rebellions, the conquerors had promoted a man named Psamtik as their chief vassal in Egypt. When they disappeared, he was able to proclaim himself king of both Upper and Lower Egypt. The Assyrians would not be coming back, as their empire would fall relatively shortly after, being largely replaced by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But this newly formed 26th dynasty would not usher in a new golden age. Though Egypt had successfully resisted an incursion from the Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, the political situation in Asia continued to evolve rapidly, and the new empire one far larger than any other had ever existed before, came to be. The Empire of Persia, formed from the conquests of his founder Cyrus, would be the one to put an end to the 26th dynasty. The name of the country's conqueror would be Cambyses. Egypt was never truly pacified by the Persians. Numerous rebellions occurred, including one so successful, locals held kingship over the country for 60 years. Egypt's distance from the core of the empire may explain why it was so difficult to control. But it should also be kept in mind, most information on these rebellions derives from Greek authors eager to underscore Persia's setbacks. The Persians did try to integrate themselves within the existing Egyptian ideologies and religious structure, and certainly went out of their way to avoid spurning the country's culture. Elsewhere in their vast empire, they also accepted and promoted local traditions, so their attitude towards Egypt was not unique in this respect. When Herodotus told the story of how Emperor Cambyses went mad and killed the Apis bull in Saqqara, he most likely repeated a lie. We know that the king buried the sacred animal with all the usual honors, and that he supported other Egyptian cults, as did his successors. Persians were portrayed as Vandals because it supported the idea that the Greeks were the true guardians of civilization. Regardless, Persia would eventually rule supreme. The 30th dynasty was the last truly Egyptian dynasty the country would have. Even so, Egypt continued resisting Persian rule to no avail. The Egyptians had to wait until a Macedonian king by the name of Alexander crushed the Persian forces in Asia for the overthrow of that regime. In 332 BCE, Alexander entered the country unopposed. Alexander, the young king of Macedonia to the north of Greece, was a historical figure whose actions had a profound impact on the world far after his death. His army conquered the Persian Empire and lands beyond in less than a decade, which was completely unprecedented at the time. Only his men's fatigue seems to have prevented Alexander from going even farther east. As a part of the Persian Empire, Egypt would come under his dominion as well. The conquest started the final period of ancient Egyptian history, one which in many respects was very different from what preceded it. Egypt's ruling class was unabashedly foreign and had no qualms about being distinct from the majority of the population. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which would rule the country after the death of Alexander, largely did not speak Egyptian but Greek. The royal dynasty resided in the country, albeit in a city on its margins, and imposed many customs and practices that were entirely foreign to Egyptians. But Egyptian culture did not disappear rapidly. Its roots in deep antiquity and its accomplishments were so obvious everywhere that they couldn't be ignored. This, too, is applicable to Egypt under the control of the Romans. History is a constant interaction between continuity and change, and both Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt shows these two forces at work. Ancient Egyptian culture ceased to exist during the Roman Empire. It had survived numerous political regimes and cultural influences from Asia, Africa, and Europe in its long history of over 3,000 years. But in the first few centuries AD, its institutions and other means of expression vanished and were replaced by new ones. These processes were complex, and scholars focus on many aspects of Egyptian culture to seek explanations. The Edict of Emperor Theodosius in 391 AD, which closed down temples and forbade the teaching of hieroglyphic writing, was likely the final step in what had been a long decline of Egypt's ancient traditions. Its importance still cannot be denied, as it took away the last support for the official articulation of ancient Egyptian culture. Political and administrative developments since the Roman conquest had weakened crucial aspects of Egypt's ancient ideology. The Roman emperor, being the ruler of Egypt, no longer resided in the country, nor did he participate in its festivals and public events. The construction of traditional temples did not get royal visits. The economic crisis of the 3rd century had reduced state support for such projects in any case. The Roman administration also enforced the use of Greek for legal and administrative purposes, relegating the writing of Demotic to literature and religious materials. It also promoted foreigners in government at the expense of indigenous priests, who lost the means to sponsor traditional expression of Egyptian ideas. The rise of Christianity would have the more decisive impact on Egypt's culture. The early Roman Empire was a religious melting pot that incorporated numerous influences, including Egyptian ones. Within this enormous diversity, the monotheistic ideas of a small religious sect from Palestine gained a special appeal to the urban middle classes. In the first centuries of its existence, the elaboration of the Christian creed and its fusion with Greek philosophical concepts, especially Neoplatonic ideas, occupied many thinkers. In Egypt's Alexandria, as a center of intellectual activity, played a major role in these developments. Its survival over other religions would lead to the extension of the religion's popularity extended to the lower classes of Egypt as well. Once Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 4th century, the church increasingly became an instrument of imperial government. We cannot determine how quick was the conversion to Christianity in Egypt. The end of the persecution during the early 4th century likely accelerated the process, and increasingly large numbers of people gave their children names with Christian references in them. By the end of the 4th century, signs of non-Christian religious observance almost fully disappeared, and some 90% of people's names attested in the written sources contained biblical elements. The traits of ancient Egyptian society had largely disappeared. It is the inevitability of all civilizations that they will eventually disappear. What remains is the memory of them, which the people of today have preserved. As for ancient Egypt, its memory is preserved by the historians and archaeologists who uncover their mysteries and pass their contents to the common people. Its uniqueness has captured the imagination of many, to the point people still talk about it today, this installment very much included. During the early 18th century, 2 English poets, named Percy Bysse Shelley and Horace Smith, decided to engage in a friendly competition, using the subject of King Ramses II of Egypt. The message of both poems is essentially the same, and both works are even somewhat similar to each other. But Shelley's poem is the far more famous of the two. His work perfectly illustrates how the march of time can destroy even the greatest of legacies.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on those lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. No thing besides remain. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away."
As a civilization, Egypt lasted for over 3,000 years. More impressively, for a very long time, that civilization remained largely unchanged. Very few can claim they lasted for as long. Thank you for watching. I'd like in particular to thank the people who provided their voice for certain passages, those being Pax Romana, Historia Militum, Conventus Orbis, Romaboo Ramblings, Flashpoint History, and, myself, since I found no one with the chops to do Ramses II's passage. In case you're confused why I say thank you for watching while listening to this podcast, that's because there's a video component to each episode, which is available on YouTube through my channel, Prism History. I do have to say though, after this, the pace of each podcast installment will be slower, as the previous projects had been made beforehand. I'll see you next time, where the subject will be the first civilization of all, Sumer.